runway on a volcanic island sitting in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean determines whether the United States can move B-52 bombers, KC-46 tankers, or F-22 fighters from the American East Coast to Europe in under 12 hours. It's 4,500 feet of Portuguese asphalt that most Americans have never heard of, but that the Pentagon considers irreplaceable. The base is called Lajes Field, and in 2015, the United States almost lost it entirely. Here's why that nearly became a strategic disaster, and why the Pentagon is quietly pouring resources back into this remote island outpost in 2026. The geography that makes Lajes irreplaceable. Lajes Field sits on Terceira Island in the Azores archipelago, roughly 2,300 miles from the US East Coast and 1,200 miles from mainland Europe. That positioning makes it the only true mid-Atlantic divert and refueling option for transatlantic military flights. Without Lajes, aircraft flying from the United States to Europe or the Middle East face a choice: carry enough fuel to make the crossing in one hop, which reduces weapons payload and limits aircraft types that can make the journey. Or rely on aerial refueling over open ocean, which is weather-dependent, requires additional tanker aircraft, and introduces points of failure. Lajes eliminates that dilemma. Aircraft can land, refuel, conduct maintenance checks, swap crews if needed, and continue to their destinations without the complexity and risk of mid-ocean tanker rendezvous. For heavy cargo aircraft like the C-17 or C-5, which carry outsized equipment that can't be easily distributed across multiple smaller planes, Lajes provides the margin that makes transatlantic deployment feasible on tight timelines. The island itself is volcanic, rugged, and small, with Terceira covering roughly 150 square miles. The climate is maritime temperate, meaning persistent wind and frequent cloud cover, but relatively mild temperatures year-round. The runway runs northeast to southwest, and crosswinds are a constant factor that pilots account for during approach and landing. The base infrastructure includes fuel storage, maintenance hangars, billeting for transient aircrews, and communications facilities that connect into broader US and NATO command networks. What makes Lajes strategically critical isn't comfort or convenience, but the absence of alternatives. There are no other mid-Atlantic airfields with comparable runway length, fuel capacity, and security infrastructure available to US forces. Iceland's Keflavik Air Base sits farther north and serves transatlantic routes, but it doesn't offer the same positioning for aircraft heading to southern Europe, the Mediterranean, or the Middle East. Lajes is the linchpin that enables rapid reinforcement of NATO's southern flank and fast deployment to crisis zones in North Africa and the Levant. The World War II origin and Cold War evolution. Lajes Field became strategically significant in 1943 when Portugal, officially neutral during World War II but maintaining a centuries-old alliance with Britain, granted the Allies access to airfields in the Azores. The agreement allowed British and later American forces to operate anti-submarine patrol aircraft from the islands, extending Allied air coverage over the mid-Atlantic and closing the gap where German U-boats had previously operated with relative impunity. P-2 Neptune maritime patrol aircraft conducted anti-submarine warfare missions from Lajes, hunting German submarines that threatened Allied convoys carrying men and material to Europe. The Azores position meant aircraft could cover shipping lanes that had previously been beyond the effective range of land-based air power, reducing losses and helping secure the Atlantic supply routes that were critical to sustaining Allied operations in Europe and North Africa. After the war ended, Lajes transitioned from a temporary wartime facility to a permanent Cold War installation. The United States and Portugal formalized basing arrangements, and Lajes became a key node in NATO's Atlantic defense architecture. The US Navy installed SOSUS, the sound surveillance system, using underwater hydrophones to detect Soviet submarines transiting between the Arctic and the Atlantic. The Azores position made it ideal for monitoring Soviet naval movements, and Lajes hosted personnel and facilities supporting this intelligence collection mission. During the Cold War's peak, Lajes hosted the 65th Air Base Wing, a full-spectrum installation with over 3,000 U.S. personnel permanently stationed on the island. The base supported strategic bomber rotations, aerial refueling operations, maritime patrol missions, and intelligence collection. KC-135 tankers stationed at Lajes extended the range of US and NATO aircraft operating across the Atlantic and Mediterranean, and the base served as a critical waypoint for moving forces from the United States to Europe during exercises and contingencies. The base's most visible moment came during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when the United States launched Operation Nickel Grass, an emergency airlift to resupply Israeli forces facing coordinated attacks from Egypt and Syria. Most European allies, fearing Arab oil embargoes, refused to allow American transport aircraft to use their airfields for refueling during the airlift. Portugal, under pressure but honouring its alliance commitments, allowed the United States to use Lajes as a refueling hub. KC-135 tankers staged from Lajes, refueling C-5 and C-141 cargo aircraft carrying weapons, ammunition and equipment to Israel. Without Lajes, the airlift would have been significantly more difficult and potentially impossible on the timeline required. The 2015 drawdown that nearly ended Lajes. By 2015, the Cold War had been over for more than 2 decades, defense budgets were under pressure following the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Pentagon was looking for cost savings wherever possible. Lajes, with its large permanent American footprint, high operational costs, and reduced Cold War mission relevance, became a target for cutbacks. The United States reduced its presence at Lajes by approximately 80%, shrinking the 65th Air Base Wing down to the 65th Air Base Group, a much smaller administrative unit. Permanent US personnel dropped from over 3,000 to around 500, and many facilities were mothballed or handed over to Portuguese control. The KC-135 tanker presence was eliminated, and the base transitioned from a full-service operational installation to what amounted to a contingency airfield maintained in warm status. Portugal, facing its own economic challenges following the European debt crisis, struggled with the question of whether to continue maintaining Lajes at operational readiness without significant American cost-sharing. The base employs local Portuguese workers, and the surrounding community had grown economically dependent on the American presence over decades. The drawdown hit Terceira's economy hard, and Portuguese officials questioned whether the lease arrangements originally negotiated during the Cold War still made sense given the reduced American commitment. For several years, the future of Lajes was uncertain. Portugal kept the lights on, maintained the runway, and continued operating its own Airbase No. 4, which shares the facility with the American presence, but discussions about renegotiating or potentially ending the lease arrangement began circulating in Lisbon and Washington. The base looked like a Cold War relic sliding toward irrelevance, a strategic asset that had outlived its purpose and was waiting for someone to officially close the chapter. Why Lajes suddenly matters again in 2026. Then, the strategic environment shifted in ways that made Lajes relevant again, but for different reasons than during the Cold War. Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic increased significantly beginning in the mid-2010s, with Russian submarines conducting patrols near undersea fiber optic cables that carry the vast majority of transatlantic internet and financial data traffic. These cables, while not military targets in the traditional sense, represent critical infrastructure whose disruption would have massive economic and communications consequences. Russia demonstrated willingness to operate in close proximity to these cables, raising concerns in NATO capitals about potential sabotage scenarios. Monitoring Russian submarine movements and maintaining the capability to respond quickly to potential threats required persistent maritime patrol aircraft presence over the Atlantic, exactly the kind of mission Lajes was originally designed to support. The base's value as a forward operating location for P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, the modern successor to the P-3 Orion, became apparent again. China's growing interest in the Atlantic also factored into renewed Pentagon attention on Lajes. Chinese commercial and potentially military interest in Atlantic sea lanes, port facilities in West Africa, and scientific research activities near undersea cables prompted U.S. strategists to reconsider Atlantic domain awareness and response capability. Lajes provides a monitoring and response node that extends American reach into ocean space where U.S. presence had atrophied after the Cold War. But the most immediate driver of Lajes' renewed importance is the straightforward reality of rapid NATO reinforcement requirements. Tensions with Russia over Ukraine, increased NATO force readiness requirements, and the need to demonstrate credible deterrence along NATO's eastern flank mean the United States must be able to move significant air power from North America to Europe quickly. F-22 fifth-generation fighters, B-52 strategic bombers, and the new KC-46 Pegasus tankers all require mid-Atlantic refueling or divert capability for efficient transatlantic deployment. The Pentagon's planning for contingencies involving Iran also elevated Lajes' importance. If the United States needs to surge air power to the Middle East from bases in Europe or directly from North America, Lajes becomes a critical node in that deployment chain. B-52 bombers staged through Lajes can reach targets across the Middle East with less aerial refueling support than missions originating from the continental United States, and Lajes provides a fallback option if European bases become unavailable due to political constraints or security concerns. The 2026 reality of joint operations. In 2026, Lajes operates as a genuinely joint U.S. Portuguese facility rather than an American base with Portuguese presence on the margins. The 65th Air Base Group provides the core American military administrative structure, but day-to-day operations integrate Portuguese Air Force personnel, facilities, and command structures in ways that reflect both nations' investment in keeping the base viable. KC-46 tankers now stage through Lajes regularly, supporting bomber task force rotations, fighter deployments, and exercises across Europe. The base has become a visible symbol of U.S. commitment to NATO's southern flank and a signal to both allies and adversaries that American military presence in the Atlantic is enduring rather than episodic. Modernization talks are underway involving runway improvements, upgraded fuel storage capacity, enhanced communications infrastructure, and facilities upgrades that reflect the base's renewed strategic importance. These investments, coordinated under NATO's steadfast posture aimed at strengthening alliance readiness, indicate that both the United States and Portugal view Lajes as a long-term asset rather than a legacy facility being maintained out of inertia. The American footprint remains smaller than during the Cold War peak, but it's growing again as operational tempo increases. Transient aircrew billeting stays consistently occupied, fuel throughput has increased, and exercises involving US and Portuguese forces use Lajes as a hub for coordinating Atlantic-facing operations. The base supports not just American aircraft, but NATO partners conducting long-range deployments, providing a shared capability that benefits the broader alliance. Portugal benefits from the arrangement through economic activity on Terceira, enhanced security cooperation with the United States, and influence within NATO that a small nation might not otherwise possess. The Portuguese Air Force operates its own missions from the base, including maritime patrol and search and rescue operations, and shares infrastructure costs with the United States in ways that make maintaining the facility economically feasible for Lisbon. The math that keeps Lajes alive. The strategic logic is simple. Without a mid-Atlantic refueling and divert option, NATO's ability to reinforce its eastern flank quickly degrades significantly. Every hour added to deployment timelines matters when deterrence credibility depends on demonstrating that American and Allied forces can arrive in theater before an adversary consolidates gains. Lajes cuts hours off transatlantic crossings, reduces the number of tanker aircraft required to support bomber and fighter deployments, and provides a backup option if weather, mechanical issues, or operational requirements force aircraft to divert. For bombers flying from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana or Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota to targets in the Middle East or exercises in Eastern Europe, Lajes turns a logistically complex mission requiring multiple aerial refuelings into a manageable flight with a single intermediate stop. For fighters like F-22s or F-35s deploying from the United States to European bases, Lajes provides the margin that allows these aircraft to make the crossing without requiring the kind of extensive tanker support that strains Air Force resources and introduces vulnerability windows over open ocean. The alternative to maintaining Lajes is accepting longer deployment times, higher costs, greater logistical complexity, and reduced operational flexibility. For adversaries watching American force projection capabilities, the existence of Lajes means the United States can move power across the Atlantic fast enough that windows of opportunity close quickly. Remove Lajes from the equation, and those windows open wider, potentially changing adversary calculations about what they can accomplish before American forces arrive in strength. The Pentagon almost lost Lajes in 2015 during a period when budget pressures and shifting strategic priorities made the base look expendable. Less than a decade later, the strategic environment has evolved in ways that make Lajes essential again. Not for the Cold War missions it was originally built to support, but for the requirements of deterring Russia, monitoring China's Atlantic ambitions, enabling rapid NATO reinforcement, and projecting power toward the Middle East. A single 4,500-foot runway on a volcanic Portuguese island decides whether American air power can cross the Atlantic in operationally relevant timeframes. That's not hyperbole, but basic geography and aviation math. No mid-Atlantic option means no fast NATO reinforcement. That reality is what keeps Lajes Field alive, relevant, and increasingly important in 2026, despite nearly being abandoned a decade ago.